Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Now, before I get into the whole, how my week went, etc. stuff, I thought I'd move the stuff that I usually do at the end of the show up to the beginning. At the end of the show, I usually talk about the things you can do to help individuals or institutions in need with people through Patreon, GoFundMe, Crowdfunder, Kickstarter, things like that. And with institutions, I wanted to point out that today, which is November 29th, 2022, is Giving Tuesday. Most people don't listen to this in real time, but still, I'm hoping some of you do. And because it's Giving Tuesday, I want to kind of implore you guys to donate. Make donations, make contributions to institutions and foundations that need it. This morning, I had my morning coffee, donated to my undergrad and grad schools, also donated to the CLL Society because of my whole leukemia thing. But there are a lot of places you can donate and try to make a little difference, make the world a little bit better. So go do that, would you? Now, not much to tell since last week. Thanksgiving, it was pretty mellow. We were supposed to have 3 friends over. Only one of them made it. One got COVID. Another one got a stomach bug. So basically, we had way too much food for 3 people, but had a great time just shooting the breeze, chowing down an awful lot. And after that, I was just in general shutdown mode for a couple of days. No recording sessions, no driving anywhere, no nothing. I just chilled the heck out, read, did a little drawing, worked out. Otherwise, just took it easy. Got ready for this weekend's 2 upcoming shows, which will help us finish out 2022, which still blows my mind that we're somehow about to hit December. But anyway, I hope you all had a good week. If you were in the U.S. or you otherwise observed Thanksgiving, I hope you had a great holiday. Now let's get to this week's show. My guest is one of my very first guests, somebody who I love recording with and have stayed in touch with over the years, Drew Friedman, the great artist and cartoonist, but really artist. Drew has a new book out called Mavericks and Lunatics, Icons of Underground Comics. And those all end with X's instead of S or CKS or whatever. Mavericks and Lunatics, Icons of Underground Comics, comes from Fantagraphics. It's got a foreword by Mark Maron and an essay at the end by Patrick Rosencrantz, who's a scholar of the underground comics era. This book is 101 painted portraits of great figures from the underground, as well as biographical sketches that Drew writes about each one of them. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It's this wonderful, wonderful collection. I mean, thematically or structurally, it's the same as his Heroes of the Comics, the old Jewish comedians. Actually, I don't know if the old Jewish comedians collection had a biographical essays or not. But anyway, the paintings here are they're just luminous. He puts so much into these renditions of these figures. They're all black and white and watercolor washes in this collection. And as we talk about during the episode, this is the first time I've really pored over Drew's artwork since I started, my feeble attempts at drawing and painting myself. And as much as I loved his work before, I'm in so much greater awe of it now. Just seeing what he does with the lines, seeing what he does with shades and the effects that he manages to get with the same set of tools that I have, but a lifetime of practice and such an eye that he brings to it all. So it was really a wonderful book. It was great to see how he captures these cartoonists from photos in realistic but not photorealistic way, how he brings his own style to every one of these paintings and manages to really capture something human in each and every one of these artists. Now, the one thing to point out that Drew talks about in the conversation, unlike the old Jewish comedians or some of the other collections he did, these paintings are of the cartoonists in their prime. And so you get so many of them as younger people. And that's a weird trip looking at some of Drew's work, because one of his collections is called Warts and All. And when you think of him, sometimes there's that, we'll say almost that grotesquerie of all the wrinkles and the sagging features, et cetera. And he's capturing something else with these artists, getting them in their 20s and 30s for the most part. Some of them are a little older at the time. There's one or two who were in their teens in the photo from which Drew works. But when you see what he brings to these people and you know how he brings them to life through these paintings, it's an absolutely wonderful collection. And like I say, the biographical sketches, they're all about a paragraph or so on the facing page against the portrait. They really... Well, they capture a long ago time. They capture what was special about, well, the artists, the comics they were making, the world they were helping to build. It's really, really an amazing collection. One of the things I'm happiest to have read this year. So again, that's Mavericks and Lunatics, Icons of Underground Comics. And again, Mavericks, Lunatics, and Comics all end with an X. Go get it. It's from Fantagraphics. Drew and I have recorded a few times before. I don't want to bore you with any more of this stuff. We recorded in person. My only real caveat is at one point I try to remember the one portrait that Drew's talking about, that he does, that's got a sort of larger head and a smaller body. I draw a blank at the time. I went back in the book afterwards. It's Jim Osborne. I checked with Drew. He does not think that's a large head on a small body. He just thinks Jim had a really giant amount of hair on a regular size head. So that's where we are. Now here's Drew's bio from the book. Drew Friedman's comics and illustrations have appeared in Raw, Weirdo, Heavy Metal, National Lampoon, Spy, Mad, The New Yorker, The New York Observer, Snarf, Honk, Blab, Bad News, Mineshaft, Airmail, and many other publications that no longer exist. In his New York Times review of Drew Friedman's Old Jewish Comedians, Stephen Heller wrote, "A festival of drawing virtuosity and fabulous craggy faces, Drew Friedman might very well be the Vermeer of the Borscht Belt." The Society of Illustrators hosted a main gallery showing of Friedman's Old Jewish Comedians portraits in 2014. I attended the opening for that, one of the greatest moments of my life. The Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at Ohio State University held a major exhibition of his All the Presidents portraits in the fall of 2019. Friedman and his wife Kathy Bidas live in semi-seclusion with their their retired AKC Grand Champion Beagle, Della. And now, the 2022 Virtual Memories Conversation with Drew Friedman. So tell me about the Undergrounds. Tell me tell me your history with them and what led to the book.
We're recording?
Yes, we are.
Well, the history of them is in the book, but the history of doing this book began after I did the first two books of mainstream cartoonists, comics artists, who worked in the world of comic books in the 30s and 40s and started their work then. And then I didn't want to do a third book, but I considered doing a book, jumping a decade to the underground comics and doing portraits of all the underground comics creators. But I hesitated because I really was not a fan of all of them. In fact, some of them are my favorite artists, obviously, Robert Crumb and Kim Deitch and Justin Green, Bill Griffith, etc. A bunch of them. Some of my favorite artists ever. But then there are others that I was either indifferent to or just didn't like. I didn't like their work, and I'm not going to mention any names.
Nope.
And that was my hesitation. Like, do I really want to commit to doing a book of 100 portraits or so of these people when so much of the work, to my mind, a lot of the work was pretty mediocre or just not very good. A lot of people got into underground comics because it was the thing to do. You know, they weren't making money, but it was, undergrounds were getting attention and whatnot. So that was my problem, and I wasn't committing to it. But I had lunch with Robert Crumb in early 2019. We were presenting him, John Cook and I, with the Book of Weirdo, in New York. So we had lunch with him at the Bowery Hotel. And I mentioned that dilemma to him, and he said, "So what? You don't have to like everybody you draw." Which, of course, made perfect sense, because I've drawn Donald Trump so many times over the years, starting with Spy.
Yeah.
And so that's when I committed to doing the book, and that was early 2019. I started, I think the first one I did was S. Clay Wilson, and I just moved on from there. And then pandemic hit and lockdown, and that became my lockdown book. I worked on it for 2 years.
I have to say, I know it's organized alphabetically, of course, but the fact that it ends with Williamson and S. Clay Wilson made me happy. That,
I guess that's apropos. Williamson, maybe aside from Crumb, is the person you really think about. He's the most underground of all of them. In fact, he had the biggest influence on Crumb, where Crumb went beyond where he was, with the sexual stuff and the misogyny and the racial stuff, and that was all influenced by Wilson. Wilson just opened up his mind to drawing that stuff, where his stuff earlier was it was always beautiful and beautifully rendered, but there was lots of it was kind of cutesy and flowery and hippie-ish, and then little by little it got darker, and that was, I think, because of Wilson. But
I would think S. Clay Wilson would have that effect on everybody. But
he did. I was I don't know if he influenced me, but I certainly loved. I used to stare at those amazing pages. You couldn't figure out what was going on unless you spent a lot of time with it. And you could oh my God, this is happening. But he did influence a guy like Joe Coleman and Glenn Head, certainly. And a lot of people. I don't know if he had an influence on me. I just loved his work, and I still do.
Were there any people, you mentioned the, not loving everybody in that world. Did your opinions of any of the artists or creators change?
One of the things I did every day when I was working on this book was go through my old underground comics collection. Mm-hmm. I have a fairly substantial one. It's not complete by any means. And it's yellowing, because I don't believe in putting comics in plastic bags or anything. Yeah. So I was just reintroducing myself, and also going back and looking at work from artists whose work I didn't particularly like or wasn't interested in, and then seeing them from a different perspective. Richard Corbin is a guy who's I have some of his comics, but it never really did much for me. I was indifferent to it, But I just looking at his stuff again, I just started picking up on the quality of his technique and his craftsmanship, and you just can't deny that, even though the subject matter was never really that interesting to me, So it's pretty amazing, and a bunch of them too. Dave Sheridan, I had a new appreciation for. Rand Holmes. A bunch of them, a lot of them. And, there's still some that it's okay, well. But everybody I included in this book, I have 101 people. And there were over 3,000 people who worked on underground comics over that 10-year period. So, there were a lot to choose from, but I wanted to just really center on who I felt were the essential ones, even though some of them were unknown to me when I began the book, but then I just was cross-referencing. In Jay Kennedy's book on the Underground Comic Price Guide, where he lists every single artist and where their work appeared in underground comics, and I was discovering several people who I hadn't heard of, and then just seeing some amazing quality in their work.
And people you gained newfound respect for. In that way?
Certainly, that too. But there were a couple of artists like Harry Driggs. I had never heard of him, and if you look at his picture, his drawing in the book. Somebody said oh man, he looks like he could be a member of the Manson family. I said, no, he looks like he could be Manson himself. But he was a seriously talented cartoonist, although he did work, he created this book called Life and Loves of Cleopatra. It was kind of a pre-underground comics. Came out in 1967. But it was really pornographic. And in fact, it crossed the line because it even had some kiddie porn in it. So it's kind of disturbing. But the quality of the cartooning is amazing. And the guy was more of an art director. In fact, he later did the graphics for the Green Party in 1980 before he died. But he was a character. I mean, just looking at his image, he's one of these guys that was just nothing on him, no reference. I couldn't find anything but one photo, one single photo, and that's what I used. Although I changed it a bit, I added different background to it, and but his face is, if you see the book, you'll see Harry Driggs. Look him up. And there's another guy, Andy Martin, who's like the polar opposite because he looks like the guy you would least expect to be an underground cartoonist. Straight-laced, short hair, polo sweater, but his work was really interesting. He was inspired by George Grosz, and he did work early on, for Yellow Dog tabloid and then the comic book, before he just stopped doing comics. He graduated from college. He was young. And just went on and did other things and didn't do any more. He continued painting, but he didn't do any more comics.
Is there anyone you sort of think, wow, I wish this guy would have made more works outside of the people who died too young?
Yeah.
But
there's a few guys like Jeffrey Catherine Jones.
Yeah.
He dabbled in underground comics, but he was in demand in the 70s.
Yeah.
So he was doing album covers and mainstream comic book stuff and posters. And he was like Frank Frazetta was in demand. So was Jeff Jones. So he dabbled in underground comics. A few other people like Mike Vosberg was mainly a mainstream comics artist, but he also dabbled. He did a little bit of here and there. He worked in underground comics, and so much so that I felt they should be included in this book. And a couple of it. There's one guy named George Hack Vogren, who he didn't do that much. He did one comic for the print mint in 1970 called Captain. It's like a nice, melancholy. Charming comic with this character, Captain. He did a little bit for Yellow Dog as well, the tabloid. And then he stopped doing comics. He became a fine artist. But he's the oldest guy in the book. He was born in 1920, which means when he was working in underground comics, he was already in his 50s, which is kind of interesting.
In a dirty old man sort of way? Or
I don't know. Well, he was married, and he was another guy I couldn't find reference, although Patrick Rosenkrantz, who did the afterword to the book, was an underground comics authority, wrote an amazing book called Rebel Visions. On the history of undergrounds. He actually went to Hack Vogren's home, I think in upstate New York or possibly New Hampshire, and took a bunch of photos of him. So he sent me some of those. So I was able to concoct my image of Hack Vogren from that.
Is there anyone you just couldn't find any photo for that you would have wanted to?
Yeah, one guy, and his name is not going to come to me now. He did one comic book for the print mint, but his work was really of great quality, I thought, real interesting cartoon style. And I don't remember his name. He did one character, just one single comic. That's all he did. But I would have included him because the comic was really good. But I didn't. I couldn't find anything. And I have a friend named John Wendler who has an amazing knack for finding reference for me and information, obscure. He's just, I don't know how he does it, but he couldn't even come up with anything. But there are a couple of guys I could only come up with maybe one or two images. And then you have a Robert Crumb. It's you can pick and choose, and a lot of
That's what I wondered, with some of the big names, the ones who have a lot of photography. What was the moment you cheat and have two Crumbs?
There's two Crumbs, and I wanted the cover Crumb is full color. It's based on a photo that was taken for Life magazine by Harry Benson. For the Life magazine, going to do a spread on Robert Crumb in 1968, that early, when Zap had just, when underground comics had kind of exploded on the scene and were dubbed underground comics by the media. Robert Crumb was the star. So, I don't think he was that into it, but he went along with the program. Life magazine followed him around New York City, photographing him in the subway, in the East Village, here and there. And plus the image I used, I changed the glasses, I turned it into color, I put a different jacket in him, I gave him a different background. But I love that photo. Yeah. And I put the X-ray specs on him because Crumb still sticks those on, because he's kind of shy and people want to photograph him, at his house in France. So they'll stick those specs on. So I thought that was apropos. So I have the Crumb on the cover, and then the more subdued Crumb inside, which is more the way I think of him, just unto himself, not wanting to be bothered, just wanting to be left alone to draw. And that's what I wanted to capture.
He's drawing in the...
He's drawing, but you don't see what he's drawing. The pages are blank. And I considered, okay, what am I going to have him drawing? And I actually sketched out a couple of things, like just the beginnings of some things. And I said, no, let me just leave those pages blank, let people think about like what he might be about to, because he's always has a sketchbook with him. So he's about to start, he's at a page, 2 pages that are blank. He's about to start. But, it's that mid-70s crumb where the cover crumb is earlier, late 60s. So it's kind of, and then Underground Comics kind of faded out in the mid-70s by by the end of Arcade is when I, in my mind, that's the official end of Underground Comics.
Does that mean the alt cartoonists are next?
Well, that became next. I'm not doing that.
That's my question.
People always suggest like, okay, what is your next project, or here's something you should do. But I've drawn a few of those people, like Chris Ware and Dan Close and Kaz. I drew Kaz on the cover of the Book of Weirdo. A few others. But I'm not going to go there. I think I'm done with comics as far as doing books. I'm not going to do it. People said, like, are you going to do mainstream comic creators from the 80s, 90s? And I said, I don't think so. I didn't really follow that stuff, and it doesn't really interest me. But I'm not going to do the alt thing either.
When you mentioned this book coming on the heels, as it were, of the Heroes of the Comics, 2 volumes, it got me wondering whether your previous project of Old Jewish Comedians is actually what really is the precursor. Does this have more similarities, I guess, in a sense, to
yes and no. The Old Jewish Comedians, in a way it does, because somebody asked me the other day when I was in New York, well, you love all those old Jewish comedians, and that's why you did those books. I said, no, I don't love them all.
Yeah.
I said, there's many of them I don't like at all. I mean, I don't think they're funny. I never did. And many of them are, I love, like Jerry Lewis and Milton Berle and the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges, etc. Sid Caesar, Buddy Hackett, you can go on and on. But there's some, like Eddie Cantor, I just always found annoying. I never got it. George Jessel, to me, I've never heard one funny utterance from his mouth, although I am completely amused by him and fascinated by him. I can go on and on about George Jessel, but I'm certainly not a fan. But what I loved about those guys was just how they just wanted to stay in the game, even when they got old. And that's why I wanted to draw them old, because they just never wanted to stop. They still wanted to be funny, even if they were never funny, or they were no longer funny, or, they were attempting to be funny, but it was kind of pathetic at that point because they're old men. Still, I just love that drive they all had, all of them. They weren't retiring types, So, but with the underground cartoonists, again, I wasn't a fan of all of them, but, I wanted to capture that era, that 10-year era. So I wanted to draw them in their prime. Sadly, a lot of them didn't make it to, become old, like Rory Hayes and Vaughn Baudet, certainly, and a few others. So I couldn't really go there, like here they are as old people. It wouldn't have worked. But I wanted to capture that era.
Yeah. Yeah, it just made me think, culturally, in a sense, that the underground guys might have more resonance with the old Jewish comedians in a strange...
They do, because most of them wanted to be funny. They were like comedians on paper, Like always, like when Bobby London is a friend, Dirty Duck. Yeah. He's a comedian, but he draws, but he's an incredibly funny guy when you meet him. So is Robert Crumb in a more subtle, low-key way. And most of them are just like, they're funny. Even Art Spiegelman is just a funny guy. And I've never met, they're not serious people, which is appealing. You want to be around people who are funny and like that. And that's how I grew up with my dad and everything. It was like, he wasn't a jokester, but everything he said was clever, funny, and interesting. And, so I'm spoiled. I want to be around people like that. That's why I'm sitting with you, Gil.
Of course.
Because you fit in.
As opposed to one of your neighbors a few doors down the street who...
One of my neighbors, unfortunately, still have their Trump Pence signs out. So I won't. I don't have to go any further.
They're really hardcore if they don't have Pence on the sign anymore.
Oh, I've heard about that. I've heard some of them either cut his name out or cross it out.
Yeah, pass it. Even in northern New Jersey, in the nice, affluent areas, I've seen, the tape covering Pence's name.
No, so I have to say my neighbor is more open-minded. Pence's name is still there.
Yeah, so, it still has some gallows in the yard.
He's accessible.
Yeah. We talk about old Jewish comedians, and you mentioned Jerry Lewis. He did an introduction to one of your books. This time around, you've got a middle-aged Jewish comedian in Mark Maron doing the introduction. tough getting anything out of him, or was he pretty effusive? Because his introduction shows a great love for relatively obscure undergrounds, not just the standard Zap, Crumb, etc.
I have to correct you. Jerry didn't actually write an introduction. He gave me a great blurb.
That's right.
Which is just basically, Jesus Christ, I love the old Jewish comedians, and I love the old Jews, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, he was like ecstatic when he called me. You know, he loved the book, and I was worried when he called me. Maybe we've talked about this before. I was really worried when Kathy said, Jerry Lewis he just left you a message, and I had to call him back. But he loved it. He couldn't have been nicer. And we actually established a friendship and a phone. We talked on the phone like once a month till he died. As far as Mark Maron, when I did his podcast 8 years ago, we talked about underground comics. He said he was a kid who loved underground comics. Like me, discovered them when he was just very young, too young. I was 9 when I first discovered Zap. He was around that age, 10, 11. He actually saw that book in a bookstore, The History of Underground Comics, in 1973. Mark's is a little younger than me. The Mark James Estrin book, History, with a lot of like hardcore images in there. And Mark just he would just like stand. He said he'd go back to the bookstore and just like open up that book and just like He said he learned from Robert Crumb where the penis actually goes inside of a woman. He said he credits Robert Crumb with that. So I remember that when I was putting this book together, like, who am I going to get it forward to? Well, I remember Mark talking about that, and I thought, like, well, let me ask him at least, And he wrote, I get along with him fine. He wrote back, he says, I really hate doing this kind of thing. I said, well, no, okay, forget it. No big deal. It's fine. I understand. I don't like writing forwards either. I've been asked to write it. He said, no, I want to do it. I'm just telling you, I hate doing it. I said, okay.
Just so you feel the guilt, I'm still going to.
Right. Yeah. Said, I'm going to do it, but I hate doing it. I said, okay, well, just take your time. No rush, So, but he came through. I love his forward, so.
The other question I had related to this book following the heroes of the comics, you went back to black and white for this, and those were in color.
Well, there's a good reason for that. The earlier books, mainstream comics, all in color for a dime. Yeah. Those books were full color. The comic books were full color from the get-go, from the first Action Comics Superman. The full color. Underground comics were weirdly, when I was 9, and I noticed it when I opened up the first Zap, #1. Black and white, which is so strange to me. Like, oh my God, a comic book that's in black and white. I couldn't get over that. Still, in a way, it just seems so weird. So I wanted to capture that, draw these people in black and white. The cover and the back cover, full color. Yeah. But the images themselves, I just thought it made sense to draw them in black and white. I just think of that as a black and white era, even though the covers were the covers were full color back then. So, I thought that was important.
You prefer one mode versus the other?
Also the other thing is I drew this book during the pandemic, so it was a lockdown book. It was not a happy time. Sure. I wasn't in a colorful mood, I suppose. I do prefer working in black and white, and I see things more in black and white. My favorite movies are black and white. My favorite television shows are black and white. So I prefer working in black and white. If I get an assignment that, like I just did a Weird Al Yankovic book cover for a book that's coming out. Do you know about that?
I've seen, Sikoriak or somebody was telling me that
they got a lot of talented people. Bob is in there, Peter Begg, Bill Plimpton, Sam Viviano, ex-Mad people. It's, I think, I'll get back to what we were talking about, but I think this book is about to come out. It's like the Weird Al's lyrics illustrated by cartoonists, in comics form. I did the cover, but they wanted full color for the cover, and it's like, fine, sure. But if I have my choice, I prefer black and white these days. So, but I go back and forth now. I'm putting together a new collection, and I'm going back and forth between black and white and color. So.
As I was telling you before we started, this is the first time I've really looked deeply at your art since I started drawing about 1.5 years ago, and now I just plots. I mean, I was already, your work always, amazed me, even when it was the stippling comics back in the 80s onwards, but looking at things now and just seeing what goes into not just the portraits, but the backgrounds that you do just kind of blew my mind in terms of how much goes into making every one of these, and the fact that there are 100 plus of them is not a question, just one of those goddamn, I'm more impressed now that I've actually tried drawing something that I see what goes into.
Well, again, like getting back to the pandemic thing and lockdown, I just had a lot more time to work on this because I wasn't going anywhere aside from the supermarket every 2 weeks. We weren't socializing. We weren't traveling to New York. It was just like it wasn't like I was working all night, but I was just working, like around the clock every day. I mean, till I broke at 5, which I do. But I just had more time to put into this, and concentrate and work on those backgrounds. And also I did a book on presidential portraits, my previous book. And there were no backgrounds. So, in my weird way, I felt guilty about that. Like I
make up for it.
Like I'm jipping the audience or, whoever's looking at my books. So I made up for that. Yeah. So, okay, this book, I'm going to go full tilt on the backgrounds. Not in every case, but like if you look at the Trina Robbins, that took like a week and a half because of all that background information. I put her in a hippie pad, East Village hippie pad. And it was just like I put more time into the background than I did in the portrait of her in the book. So.
And some of them you end up, you like with Justin Green and people like that, for the backgrounds, you're actually using visual motifs of their work as opposed to, realist settings behind them.
Yeah, a couple of them I wanted to include their work in there. Yeah. And Justin is one of those guys. A few others. Actually, some of them I have like sitting at their desk drawing, and then what you see on the drawing table, like Vaughn Baudet is what, and Art Spiegelman too, is the current piece they're working on. I thought that was, I really wanted to mix it up. Some of them are just psychedelic backgrounds with lines. Some of them were like the Bill Griffith also took me like 2 weeks because of all that background. And I love getting into that, because cartoonists, they're solitary, they work at home, but they all seem to have stuff, swag or ephemera in their studios. I certainly do, as you can see.
We'll take a picture before we leave.
The Museum is right behind you. This is not visual, but, Gil is sitting right in front of the Museum. But to me, that was just, more interesting just to not only are you seeing the person, you're seeing their environment, what inspires them or, what they have around them.
This is why I love doing these in person as opposed to, and sitting down with Bill years ago. I can't remember if I've told you this story, but I recorded in a studio up in Connecticut, and we went over to his drawing table after, and he was showing me pages from the Pinhead biography he was working on.
Wow.
And Schlitzie, yeah. And I noticed where he had the inkwell and the pen and the nibs, there was this weird mound next to it, and I realized it was a mound of ink.
Oh, wow.
That he'd always flipped the nib.
I think I've seen photos of that.
Yeah, it's a three-dimensional pyramid of ink, which is one of those, I know you guys are all OCD about stuff, but that's the exact same place every single time.
Interesting.
And the ink just starts accreting into this thing.
So it's a collection. Someday it'll be auctioned off it'll be up on eBay.
Everybody's worried about Joan Didion's sunglasses and stuff. I want Bill Griffith's mound of ink.
I can see that being on display someday. I mean, sadly, I guess after he dies, but I'm mentioning that because, since I finished this book, I think 4 people have died. No, 5 people have died who are subjects in this book, which is I got paranoid. Like, am I responsible for that somehow?
Well, my take is I've done 10 years of the show, and until 2 months ago, only 9 guests had died out of like 400 plus.
Pretty good.
Unfortunately, 2 in the last month and a half.
One was my dad.
No, that was when your father died. I was on mic with Kip. Recording in June of 2020, and he gave me the news while we were on, and I just deflated. We kept going, but I was just, it just hit me so hard.
It's such a horrible time because that was like at the height of the pandemic.
Yeah, again,
my dad. I don't want to bring this down, but my dad was. My dad didn't have COVID, but he was not in great shape, and then that's when it happened. Yeah. And there was no funeral or anything, which was hard for everybody. But so. But since I since I finished this book, we lost Diane Newman, Justin Green, Simon Deitch, and Tom
Veitch.
Veitch, yeah.
Is it Veitch or Veitch?
I think
it's Veitch.
Take your choice. Yeah. But so and then as I was working on it, some of them were passing away. I was getting nervous, like Jesus, what's going on? I mean,
capture their souls and they're dead.
They're early mid 70s. Some of them are in their 80s. So it's like I'm just catching them. I've heard from a bunch of them since the book came out, all positive, which makes me happy. I've heard nothing but positive things from them, and some of them I was nervous about, like Trina Robbins, because I don't really know her. But I drew her, like I said, in her prime in the 70s, early 70s, East Village. And then she got the book and she emailed me and she said, I was really nervous when I heard you were going to be drawing me, I was really nervous about it. I thought you were going to make me look old and wrinkly. And I said, no, I wanted to draw you in your prime and at the height of underground comics. So she loved it and she wanted to buy the art, but it had been sold. So that kind of thing was really nice to hear. And I've heard that I keep hearing it. I heard from Mike Vosberg just last night saying, I just saw the drawing you did of me, and I can't believe that you included me in this book. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing. I've heard from a few people that were just surprised and delighted that they were included because they thought they were completely forgotten. Yeah. One was Buckwheat Florida Jr., whose name is Buckley Bell. He's in his 80s. He lives in Thailand. He's
in Thailand. Yeah, because you're
So I got an email from him out of the blue, like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you included me in this book," and it's like I'm so thrilled, and and also a couple other ones too. I've heard from family members like Andy Martin's daughter, who lives in she lives in San Francisco, I think. She was thrilled and said, I'm buying copies for all my family members and so thrilled that he's in there. And, it's like, I thought he was forgotten. I've gotten that. It's like, I thought I was forgotten. And it's like, but there I am. So that's nice.
Yeah. I'd ask what it was like for you to have grown up with, these artists and their work meaning so much to you. And then really becoming, we'll say, a peer. I know you might want to say colleagues or whatever, but that sense that you're not in the pantheon, whatever you need to say, but that these are guys you're now friends with.
It's in some cases, I wouldn't exactly say friends.
I never see that about guests either. I always figure we're friendly, but not friends.
Friendly, yeah. It's I grew up, it's interesting when I had these underground comics, and I was, like I said, I was 9 years old when I discovered them, and I started building up my collection, somehow. I had to keep them hidden, in a closet because I was as liberal as my parents were. I was terrified if they discovered them.
That's still a bridge too far. Yeah.
Or our housekeeper discovered them, I'd be in trouble. Probably none of that would have happened, but still, it was like having a stash of pornography. So I kept them hidden. So did Josh, my brother. He had his stash, and I always drew. I always liked to draw, and I always originally wanted to be a Mad Magazine contributor, one of the usual gang of idiots. I wanted to work for Topps. I accomplished both those goals. But the underground comics just threw me for a loop. And, it's not that I wanted to be an underground cartoonist because that's not a career, really. I mean, you weren't going to make money. These people weren't making money. They were just, doing what they wanted to do. But the stuff had such an influence on me, especially Robert Crumb and Jay Lynch and a bunch of them, that as I got older, it's not that I wanted to draw like them, but I was so influenced that, when I was going to School of Visual Arts, Art Spiegelman was a teacher. And so it was just good timing because he was about to start Raw Magazine. And he wanted to include some artists whose work was not known, younger artists. And sure enough, he found 3 students in the class, me, Mark Newgarden, and Kaz. And he put us in the first issue. So from there, that's we got it. We started getting attention. It was all of 2021. But that was thrilling. It was exciting. And I got my nerve up to send some of my work, early work, things I had in High Times magazine and Raw, to Robert Crumb, just like 5 or 6 things, thinking that either I wasn't going to hear back from him. He had just started Weirdo magazine, right? So he made his address he made it public. He could write him, he could send him things. So I got my nerve up and wrote him and sent him stuff, assuming that either I wouldn't hear back or he wouldn't like it. He wouldn't like my work. But he did like it. He wrote back a really enthusiastic postcard, which I still have, just saying, I've been following your work, and I would love you to do some work for Weirdo. So I got right to work on that. So from there, people would see my work in Weirdo then, and Raw, and then I started hearing from S. Clay Wilson and Justin Green and Kim Deitch, and started this correspondence with these guys. And then when they come to New York, I'd meet them and stuff, and they were all terrific, all those guys.
And does that sense of belonging? Was there a sense of, holy shit, I'm actually one of these guys, you know?
I thought of them as a different generation. Sure. It was like beyond, like they were like, you know, I looked up to them. It's like, you know, like meeting, you know, I when I was a little kid, I used to meet people like, you know, my dad worked in an office as a magazine editor, and Stan Lee was in the very next office because it was up at Magazine Management, the company that owned Marvel Comics. So, you know, from the get-go, I would like encounter these guys, and Jack Kirby would be up there sometimes, and I didn't really know who he was, but I saw this like kind of gray-haired guy sitting at a desk drawing and making corrections and stuff. And later on, I connected the dots. And, oh, right, that must have been Jack Kirby, and that must have been Steve Ditko, or that must have been John Buscema, or whoever. And so it was like, it's not that I was like, you know, like it was no big deal to me, but I kind of grew up that way, like just encountering these guys. One of my dad's closest friends was Jules Pfeiffer. These people would be around the house, you know, or when we got to dinner, they were just always around. So it wasn't like, oh my God, all of a sudden, like, you know, I'm in touch with this one or that one. It was just like, it just seemed like a natural progression.
I should ask, because I mentioned to one of my pals yesterday I was going to record with you, and he said, if you can find out what the story is on that Jules Pfeiffer panel about how Jules, you know, steals leftovers from other people's fridges, I would love to hear it.
It's like, basically, that was a comic that Josh wrote. I drew a one-page comic. I think it was in like a later underground comic called Twist, I think, in the mid 80s, I think. So it was just like one panel, like just things we had heard about Jules. Jules used to. In retrospect, Jules used to come to our house on Fire Island and, you know, and eat coleslaw and potato salad.
Long after he'd become successful.
Early 60s, mid 60s, okay. He was doing his comics, his cartoons for the Village Voice, etc. And then he'd get on his bike and leave and stuff, and that was it. So
you just turned that into a gag. You didn't have to
ask Josh about, like, you know, where he got that information.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, it's like, really, that's the documentary visual realist style that you had just made it. Well, this obviously must be true because Drew drew it.
It might have been true. I'm not even sure, but you know, it was like riffing on truth.
It makes me think of the time I pitched Jules to record. We were, all three of us were at Small Press Expo, and I said, do you have an in? Should I mention your dad? And he said, yeah, mention Dad. Don't mention me.
That's right. That's right.
Because,
you know.
Yeah,
I think Jules saw that comic and was not happy with it.
Yeah, that was basically the vibe. He's like, hey, he doesn't think so much of me, but he loves Dad.
Don't bring up my name, which is fine.
And it worked. We had a really good conversation.
That's great.
You know, it did make me think when you mentioned that next wave, when you talk about different generations within undergrounds, my late pal Tom Spurgeon used to qualify Paul Mavridis, who's in the book, as basically the one-man bridge between the original undergrounds and then the sort of the new wave world. That he was the one guy who came a little later, understood the undergrounds, you know, had them as an influence, but also kind of moved it into the 80s.
Yeah, I think there are a few people in this book that qualify, but Mavridis. I wanted to draw him with that incredible fro that he had.
Those amazing,
which people forget about.
In this whole thing, the gigantic Jew fro.
Gigantic, you know, it's like the biggest ever, like bigger than Frida Payne, who I think had an amazing fro in the 70s, and Billy Eckstein had an amazing fro in the Jackson 5. This was beyond that. This was like twice, 3 times as large. I don't know how he did it, and it didn't last, you know.
By the 80s, he went new wave, and it was all shaved.
He went new wave. Right. He jumped around. He went new wave. Now, you know, he's still around. He's on Facebook. He's cantankerous, but you know, he was really happy to be included and happy with his portrait as well. But yeah, he just jumped there. I mean, he began, I think, in the mid 70s, but then he got hooked up with the Freak Brothers and working with Dave Sheridan and Gilbert Shelton on that. And then he did Anarchy Comics with Jay Kinney. So he continued. He's one of these guys, like, you know, underground comics faded, but some of them still existed by the 80s. You know, certainly Zippy and anything Robert Crumb put out. You know, he still put out comic books. I've mentioned this before, but Crumb was like, you know, when he reminds me of Chaplin when talkies came in and everybody switched over to making talking pictures. Chaplin continued to make silent films. Crumb was the same. He, like, underground comics were over, but he still continued to put out underground comics. There were a few other guys like that. You know, the Freak Brothers still came out. So I think the whole underground comics thing petered out, but, you know, there were still people who just held on. And Mavrita is one of those guys, you know. Anarchy Comics especially, which I think debuted 1980, 81.
So when you mentioned Mavridis and the the gigantic fro that he had. One of the questions I had just looking at portrait after portrait of these, mainly men from the late 60s and 70s, how irritating was the hair to paint?
You know, that really finally got to me. At first I was like, I rolled up my sleeves, I got right into it, but then I'm about to draw this one. Oh my God,
and
look at that hair.
Too, and the little sideburns.
Well, there's one guy, a couple of people like, oh God, when I got to them, I was like, really? Again, I have to draw all that long hair? It's like, especially, when they had the long hair and the thick beard, and some of them had, I mean, it was tricky, but, because the hair has to look right. The light hitting the hair has to be correct. Trina Robbins had an amazing head of hair, not only the men, but it was like a mandatory, like, okay, you want to be an underground cartoonist, you have to grow your hair long. It's like, or else we're not going to accept you. Yeah. There's a few exceptions, Robert Crumb. His hair started getting a little long in the late 60s, early 70s, but then he cut it back. It's like John Lennon. He just cut off all his hair in like 1970. He was sick of it or something. Or he donated it, I think, to some charity. So it's like Robert Crumb, Richard Corbin, a couple others, they kept it short, which, I respect. But overall, it was like, that really started to get to me. So I made a vow, like whatever my next book is going to be old, bald men.
You do have somebody who's in there, I forget who, but you mentioned his sexual fetish was bald women, and he did a magazine of that stuff.
That's right. That's Yossarian.
That's right.
Who, was like, he had a long career in undergrounds, starting with, in the early 70s. He was doing stuff for the East Village Other and the underground publication. He was a real New York guy. And he wound up as an art director at Screw magazine. But he also, he was obsessed with bald women. So he did this magazine, The Razor's Edge. So, I threw that in there. I was, to each his own.
So Glenn had, I wrote to last night also, and he emailed while I was getting here, which is why I was in your driveway. I was writing down his questions from the
I just saw Glenn two nights ago
at the SOI event.
Yeah.
He asks just, was this the best of times for comics, the underground era?
Yes and no. Yeah. I mean, I think in his opinion, I know he just absolutely adored that world. And Glenn and I, we're about the same. We missed it. I often think I would have loved to have been part of that back then. And we kind of were, It's like I was in Weirdo, and seeing my work alongside of Robert Crumb's work was just an absolute thrill, at first. Like, I was in Weirdo #4, my first appearance, Tor Johnson. Comic about Tor Johnson, who Robert Crumb had never heard of. When I sent him the Tor Johnson piece, he wrote back and said, "I've never heard of this guy," but he ran it. He still wanted to run it in there. So just seeing my work, in Raw, with some of those people, like S. Clay Wilson was in the first issue too. I think he did a collage. But just seeing my work alongside of Robert Crumb, it was the same thrill actually I had when I first was in Mad. In like an early issue, like 1994, they called me, they called and said, "Do you want to do a piece for Mad?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And just getting that first issue and seeing my work with next to Mort Drucker's work and Al Jaffe and Paul Coker and Jack Davis was still doing work, and that was just such a thrill. And it was like past their prime, certainly Mad, but. There's like little things like that. It's just like, oh my God, I guess I've made it. Although, I still don't know if I've made it, whatever that means. But, it was like, just these like, was it the best of times? I guess for a lot of people it was. Yeah. I would like put it up there but, I think the beginning of comics in the late 30s and the 40s, that might have been the best of times. I think when EC Comics started, to me, like as far as mainstream comics, it was just nothing better than ever happened in the world, in that world, than EC Comics. And that only lasted about 5 years.
In fact, you include, of all people in this book, Harvey Kurtzman.
I thought that was important because not only did he influence most of the main people, especially Robert Crumb and Gilbert Shelton, Art Spiegelman and Jay Lynch and more. He also participated in that world, and I spell it all out in the book why he's in there. You don't think of him as an underground cartoonist, but he's, of all the mainstream guys, he's the one guy who really dove in, did several covers, collaborations with Crumb and some of the Zap guys, wrote introduction to one of Robert Crumb's books, and Crumb did an introduction to one of his comics collection of Hey Looks. He just really, he got it, and he also knew it wasn't going to last. But, you know, he was like also hailed as the father of underground comics. And when they mentioned that to him, he said, well, I demand a blood test. But I thought it was important. You know, I've drawn him before. He's in my first Heroes of the Comics book. Of course, I had him as a teacher, so I knew him pretty well. But I thought it was important he would be he's included in this book. And he's not even the oldest guy. Like I said, George Hack Bogren was born 4 years before him. So
there's continuity, there's history. It's actually a question I don't know if we ever addressed, like the first time we talked, but, and I don't want to use the term nostalgia, but your interest in history, in knowing what the histories of these we'll say pop culture areas are, where did that start for you?
So, I guess I've always been like that. I didn't want to just I wanted to become. If I pick up on something, if I'm interested in something, I want to know all the background about it. You know, if it's a movie or a TV show, it's like even from an early age, I just wanted to know everything. And now I'll move on. Like I'll be obsessed. It'll be my current obsession. You know, I'll go through it and then I'll just move on to something else and not even think about it really. Or, you know, or if we talk about it, I'll remember, right? You trigger something. But that's just the way my personality is. Just I have to know everything about, you know, even if it's something stupid like, you know, a Three Stooges short, you know, I have to know exactly what year it is, who was in it, every actor in it, what those actors did before, you know, where they came from, why, who wrote this piece, who wrote this short, who directed it, what his history was, things like that. It's just like a weird obsession, you know. It's like I'm cursed.
You've managed to turn it into, we'll say, a money-making proposition. I hope it's money-making. As far
if
as
it is, I don't even think along those lines. I mean, I sold all the artwork is sold, so I guess you know it's like I don't have to worry about how many they sell. I hope it sells well. You know, I'm really proud of this particular book. I put a lot of work into it, and people seem to like it. It's gotten nice attention. But you know, I'm just on to the next thing. You know, I don't really dwell on it.
I want to, well. You do everything, you know, physically. There's no computer. I mean, you scan afterwards and clean stuff up.
No, I don't work on the computer at all. Somebody asked me, what program do you use? And I didn't even know what that meant.
Yeah, because when I mentioned to you that sort of drawing, your thing was, you mean real on paper?
Well, because these days it's like, you know, people draw. They say they draw, they illustrate. And it's like,
just on a tablet.
I don't get that. You know, I've seen some of the stuff. Some of it's, I guess, impressive, but, you know, it's kind of soulless, you know, and I pick up on that. So it doesn't interest me. I draw, you know, at my desk, which is behind me, and you know, with pen, with ink, with watercolor on paper, and then we scan it, and Kathy helps clean it up, and then if we have to send it in, we send it in high res, and that's it, you know. But you know, the computer's not even in my office, you know,
right.
So there's no computer. I mean, you know, there's no scanner here, you know, it's in the next office. So, yeah, I don't, you know,
that's my thing.
I have no interest in working that way. And, you know, and I don't get it. I don't get it. So maybe I'm missing something, but I just have no interest.
It's a thing that, you know, especially, well, for artists whose work actually sells, where you can actually sell your
there's that,
your stuff too. That's also a thing.
I sell
a file.
I sell my original arts. And if there's a file or, you know, or if someone wants to do a show of your work, it's like, I guess you can print out.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't quite get that.
Yeah. I get the
or it doesn't apply to me. It's like, you know, more power to you if it works for you.
So it's a sort of, this is a weird meta question to ask, but again, this is something that now that I've actually started drawing, I pay attention to. How did painting change you as an artist?
Well,
because you were, well,
I was kind of forced into painting.
Yeah.
I think is I was doing the pen and ink stipple stuff.
Yeah,
and it just took forever. I mean, it really was not complicated, but you know, you just have to be patient and time consuming. You keep having to dip that pen because I used a crow quill, not a rapidograph. I used a rapidograph early on, but I just needed more variation in the line, and could get that from the crow quill pen. So it's just so time consuming. And in the early 90s, after I was doing work for Spy, I started getting hired by mainstream publications. You know, they would see my work there, and I started getting a lot of assignments. You know, some of them due the next day, and I couldn't really invest the time I had been in doing the comic strips and even the work for Spy. I had to move faster. I had to hustle, so I really had to force myself to start using a brush. And I just got into it. It's just like, it just became like, you know, now I only work with the brush. You know, I pencil, I sketch with a mechanical pencil. but then I'll paint right on top of that. So it's just like second nature. It's like working with the brush, and I can go at my own pace. But also, if you notice in my drawings, I've sort of become going full circle, where it's not that I'm stippling again, but I'm using the brush. I'm using the brush for like this effect.
It's a little not pointillist, but how do you describe it? Because
I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's a word for it, but I'm using the brush just to get that super detail, like in faces especially, and even background. But somebody pointed out, it's like you're actually getting the pores in the faces now, and I like hearing that. It's like, yeah, I guess so. It's like super realism, I suppose. Although I think there's still distortion going on in my work and slight caricature. It's not just like
you're not just rendering a photo.
No, and that wouldn't be of interest. And there's a few that are close. Because if in the case where I only had one piece of reference to work from, but I always try to reshape it into, something that looks like what I do, even if it's like I have to admit that I used to like the effect of drawing large heads on small bodies.
There's one or two in the book that are like that, unless it's somebody who's actually that malformed.
Well, like somebody, when I was at the Society of Illustrators, I showed an image of Joe Franklin. And I said, well, you can see, and there was somebody else in the drawing. I said, you can see this is at the time when I was drawing large heads on small and smaller bodies. Just it was a cartoony effect. I said, but in the case of Joe Franklin, he had a large head and a small body, so I didn't have to exaggerate.
Flipping through the book, I'm trying to remember the guy now. He was in a park or something, and
is it maybe Rory Hayes or
no, it was later in the.
Oh, was it? Okay, so I think it's in the back. Maybe the guy who worked with Jay Lynch on Phoebe and the Pigeon People.
No, I can't find it now, but
yeah, I really was pretty careful not to go that route.
It wasn't exaggerated, but it's only when you're really looking closely you start to see that the face
exaggeration. It's like I did that more with the heroes of the comics. In fact, there's one I did my Basil Wolverton portrait. I don't really like it now because I went too far on enlarging the head. It's just I'm very hard on myself. I don't really like my stipple work anymore. It's hard for me to look at. But it was a learning process. So. Yeah.
What did you have to learn about portraiture? What did you get better at?
It's hard to say. It's just again, just slowing down and just like putting more time into that's basically it. But that was just like I'm not sure how to answer that.
I wasn't sure if you started with the almost a photorealist thing before really finding. This is what I want to make it, as opposed to this is the photo that I'm looking at.
Yeah, so I think when I even if I'm using a photo and getting pretty close, I think it still looks like a Drew Friedman drawing somehow. Yeah. And also with this book, I didn't want to be a wise guy in any way with any of the drawings. I wasn't going to like somebody said you could have drawn Ned Sontag with one of his 400-pound girlfriends. I think Dan Close said that to me. He says, but you didn't go there. It's like, every drawing is respectful and, not to the point where it's just, I hope they're not boring, but, I wanted to place them in their own environment in the 70s and, but, I wasn't, even with artists whose work I didn't really like, I wasn't going to I'm just going to spend a day or two on this one because I don't, I put as much time into every drawing, as much time as I put into Robert Crumb's drawing as anybody else's. So, there was that. I think that's the thing. It's like I don't know. Art Spiegelman thinks I've mellowed. I don't know if I've mellowed, but I guess the work. I'm not. I don't have I don't have an agenda anymore, I suppose. Yeah. I'm not if I have grudges against anybody, I've forgotten about them. That's what happens.
I figure it's a sign of I don't want to say maturity because neither of us are that mature, but it's a sign of
that's right. It was
aging into decrepitude.
I guess so. But Dan Close gave a great interview recently that I listened to, a Zoom interview where he said. He used to go to comic conventions when he was just starting out, and he'd bring his piles of Lloyd Llewellyn pages and sit at these conventions. He said he was completely ignored, and everybody was just swarming towards the superhero artists. And he just built up this resentment and anger, and he would reflect it in his work somehow, especially about comic conventions. He did some great comics.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
And I went through the same kind of thing where, like, why aren't people paying more attention to what I'm doing? And, why would people be into this superhero shit? Things like that. And so, I related to that, but then he says, like, now he just laughs about it. Like, it's like we're all kind of angry when we're starting out. And then, you just grow out of that finally. And it's like, just the phase you go through. So, I went through it. I think a lot of my friends too, I remember that, we were all like kind of, like antsy and suspicious about this one or that one. And, just like, doing our thing and like wanting to get it out there. That's like the best thing, just getting your work out there, getting it seen,
And again, over time, a lot of things level out, I guess, as far as this stuff goes. You start to see the guys who were super successful young, it tends not to sustain. And,
Well, it's like, I've been persistent. I'm still doing the same thing, more or less. I don't do that many comics anymore. The last comic I did was a piece about Robert Crumb, 8-page piece. And
is that in that Monty Beauchamp book?
Yeah, and from Monty's book, Masterful Marks. And that was the last one. I thought about doing more, but it's so time-consuming. That one piece took me 4 months. That's not a bad thing, but it's like the venues aren't there like they used to be, I don't think. There's no more Weirdo, there's no more Raw.
Anthologies really plummeted. I mean, it's just really tough to sustain.
And there's some of them out there, I guess I'm not really that aware, but I don't feel that, like, the competition drive, like, seeing your work with all these other artists in Weirdo or in Raw or Heavy Metal even, or National Lampoon or there was a bunch of them back then. And they all seem to be gone. So, it's like, well, if I were to do comics, where would they even run? I mean, so,
The internet is not friendly to...
But there is, like, the option of doing it, and like Bill Griffith is doing some of his most amazing work these days as books, as those graphic biographies.
If an 8-pager took you 4 months...
Yeah, like a 100-pager would take me the rest of my life.
So
God willing. So there's that. Yeah, because I'm not going to like compromise and do. Okay, I'll just do line drawings or like that. Yeah.
One of the interesting things I saw with Bill, and it's I guess it's a question I could ask you also, the notion that his zippy work, especially, just gets tighter and tighter with each year. Where me, as someone who believes in laziness, thinks, well, after decades of doing this stuff, you have more of a shorthand to do things. And Bill was just, no, you just get more and more in control of your line, and you can do tighter and tighter stuff. I'm like,
that's him. That's him, and good for him, because a lot of cartoonists just. It's like comedians. They as they get old, like Jackie Gleason, Bob Hope, all they want to do is play golf. It's like, being...
I'll say the catchphrase and get the...
Right. Going on stage and just reading cue cards is like, okay, we'll get that over with. I just want to get out on the golf course. It's like applies to cartoonists too. Like, I think, I've heard of so many syndicated cartoonists who just like get older and they want to go play golf. Like Jack Davis wanted to quit drawing by 2 o'clock in the afternoon so he can get out on the golf course. Johnny Hart also was the BC guy. Yeah. He just he would even have these cavemen playing golf. He was so into it, if you remember. But Griffith is like, most of I think Robert Crumb, the quality hasn't, gone out of his work. I mean, he doesn't haven't seen that much lately, but he did a post-COVID piece that, I can't agree with anything he was writing about, but the artwork was amazing. It was beautiful and whatnot. And, as far as Griffith, it's like, good for him for just like, I mean, I've been asked like, well, do you think he'll retire? And I said, well, probably if I lose my eyesight, that'll do it. I don't want to be like Charles Schultz or David Levine, continue doing it and just, with the dwindling eyesight. And then the line really gets shaky and it's kind of embarrassing. And somebody should say to this person, like, it's time to hang it up. It sadly didn't happen in those two cases. I think, have you seen David Levine's the last things he did?
I don't remember.
And the New York Review of Books, I think they finally had to say to him, like, well, we can't really run your stuff anymore. A lot of people were upset by that, but it was like, you look at the stuff and it's like, well, somebody had to say it. It was kind of sad.
Yeah. But when he was so identified with that
the cross-hatching was like shaky, and then the last few pieces were just... And same with Charles Schultz at the very end. The line was just so like shaky. And
he was self-deprecating about it, I remember, because he said, people accuse me of using an assistant, but if you think I would hire somebody who drew a line this badly,
that's good. I think he did hang it up before he died. I think David Levine, like... and then you have a case like Al Hirschfeld, who was like, it's like nothing changed. He was just as, tight and, as ever. And he died the day he died, he was 99. He was closing in on 100, but he was drawing the Marx Brothers the day he died. But he was struggling with it. And, he went up, you probably know this from David Leopold, but he was struggling with it, so he just went upstairs to take a nap, and that's when he died. So that drawing it was a commissioned drawing, and the artist, the guy who commissioned it, got the unfinished artwork back, and I think it's been published, or it's been shown online.
It puts me in mind also.
And actually, it's not. You can see why he was struggling. It was not that great. Yeah. It was like there was a problem. It was the Marx Brothers coming out of the garbage cans at the beginning of Monkey Business. Lifting the lids, the kippered herring jars, or And it wasn't really working. You could see it.
It puts me in mind of Al Jaffe, who stepped down.
He's 101 now, but he did retire.
Yeah, knew that.
Of course, there's no new Mad anyway. But
still, that sense of carrying on and carrying on.
You should. Hopefully, you'll know when it's over. I think I'll know when it's over. It
was a weird experience going far afield. But when I was in London last month, I saw the Lucian Freud exhibition, and I corroborated this talking to Celia Paul, a painter I've recorded with, who had a relationship with Freud for 10 years. The very last painting that's there, it's unfinished, but it has more heart in it than a lot of Freud's, career-spanning work that's very cruel and terrible. And Celia said, he was clearly suffering from dementia, and he was painting with muscle memory, basically. Wow. The mind was sort of not doing what he usually does, and he created a much better... It's unfinished, but
that's interesting.
It's a very interesting painting because he's not bringing the acid view of the world.
In that case, I'm going to continue working even when I shouldn't be.
That's what I'm saying.
We'll see what we get. We'll see what we get at that point.
Now, when it comes to portraits, do you only work from photos, or have you done any live?
I spent my whole life just drawing faces, and you can see, like, I've posted some of them, just obsessive drawing faces, like in my classes and when I was a kid and stuff. And then I would, my brother and I, when Josh wrote the Andy Griffith comic, I thought that should look realistic. I thought that should look like the TV show, like you're watching the TV show somehow, like a Ouija version of the Andy Griffith show. So that's when I started, like, using the photo reference to get it as close as possible. And I thought that worked. A lot of people responded to that comic, and I continued from there. So that was like a decision I made. Also, the stipple was just a decision because I didn't stipple when I was a kid. I wasn't even interested in stipple work. I can't even think of any, aside from maybe Virgil Finlay, any stipple artists whose work I really liked. But it was just a decision to slow down, help me slow down, because I was drawing too fast when I was younger in high school and even going to school of visual arts. Drawing too fast. I had to slow down. So that was a way. And also, I discovered rapidograph pens, which I was fascinated by, and the best way to, the tiny little line you can get from that, and that evolved into the dots. But it was mainly the Andy Griffith piece where it was just like, I think this should look as realistic as possible, and here's the way. So, so I stuck with the realism thing, although there's a lot of distortion going on, and if you look at some of the early comics, like the Joe Franklin story, a lot of it is pretty cartoony and whatnot. So.
But as far as, just drawing from life and just sitting down with people, or even photo reference for
I used to have a sketchbook. I no longer do. So, I just like work. Crumb, I work on my pieces and I put it aside. I don't like to walk around like drawing. No, nothing like Crumb.
And again, you don't, just like me, you don't go anywhere. It's a lot different than living in the city where you can always be looking at people and doing stuff. Here,
it's like I'm not,
that's why I drew trees.
Yeah. It's like sometimes I'm tempted. I'll look at something and say, I'd really like to capture that. But, it's like when I'm out doing things, I don't want to think about work, really, or drawing. That's what I do at home. That's like my 9-to-5 job. And then when I'm not working, it's like, when a plumber is not plumbing, he doesn't want to think about it.
Look at those pipes. I can fix those.
I guess maybe that runs through people. But, I just want to, I don't want to, I'm always thinking about what I'm working on or the next thing I'm working on. In fact, as we're talking here, I'm thinking about like what I'm going to be starting tomorrow. which is a border. I like drawing borders. Yeah. I'm really into borders. So is Dan Close. So is Harvey Kurtzman, and so is Robert Crumb. I love the border because they frame your work. That's the simplest way of describing it. They frame, especially a cover. So I'm working on a border now for my next book, which it's not finished, but it's a collection of artwork that hasn't been collected in book form before. Aside from these underground portraits, I also, at the same time, over the last couple of years, I've created, like I mentioned, the Weird Al cover. Some other book covers also work for prints, like this Kurt Vonnegut I just finished a few weeks ago, and I did a Buster Keaton. I have a bucket list now, and Vonnegut, I realized he was turning 100. He wrote a forward to one of my books, Warts and All. But I've never drawn him. And I knew him, and my dad, he was friends with my dad and stuff, and he was very supportive of my work. And I just realized I've never drawn the guy, and I love his work. I love especially Slaughterhouse-Five, and some of the other things. And I'll mention, I drew Vonnegut, and then I was started thinking about it, and then I saw this photo of Jerry Lewis dressed as the character from Slapstick. Early makeup. Yeah. An early makeup version. And I just first I looked at it, I said, who is that? And it's he looks familiar. And I realized it was Jerry Lewis. I said, Jesus Christ, I gotta do something with this. So I'm working on that too. It's Jerry Lewis dressed as, I don't know the character's name from Slapstick. He's a space alien, or it's revealed at the end he's from outer space. So that's another piece I'm working on. I don't know who the audience for something like that would be, but that doesn't even cross my mind.
When you mentioned having a bucket list, is there anyone else anyone's you're comfortable naming?
I've actually, there's some, when I was doing the old Jewish comedian books, I had to leave out certain old Jewish comedians because they didn't get old. Obviously Lenny Bruce, but also Toady Fields. And there's a few others. So I'm drawing Toady Fields. I just finished Mom's Mabley. I'd never drawn her. I mean, she's not Jewish, obviously, but these are bucket list people. I've considered drawing over the years. Phyllis Diller, I've never drawn her. I just did her. People like that. Also obscure, completely forgotten or unheard of comedians. There's the magazine Mineshaft is about to come out with Glenn Hidd did the last cover. I did the cover of the one coming out. On the cover is a comedian named Charlie Robinson, who I had never heard of, but I found a photo of him online that was I loved, and I can combine that with another photo with sexy women in the background, and that's going to be the cover. That's about to come out. But I love these completely unheard of comedians, knowing about them and then discovering them. And probably they weren't very good, or they just did their thing for a few years in burlesque or vaudeville and then faded. So I like bringing them back to people's attention.
So one of my things, if I haven't drawn that day, lately I've been plotzing completely on drawing, but one of my things was I'll go to this website that has people who died on this day and birthdays for that day.
Yeah, I go to that website too.
Yeah, just see if there's anybody who jumps out, which led to the all-time greatest drawing, which I'll show you after this, of Tom Carvel.
Okay.
Yeah, it was one of the
He just had a birthday, didn't he?
I think this may have been his death day. I can't remember when, but I did that a couple of months ago and thought that might be the single greatest picture I've ever drawn. I nailed Tom Carvel. I got the nose, I got the mustache, I picked up the gleam in the eye somehow.
I'm trying to think if I ever drew him. I don't think I did. I was kind of obsessed with him back in the when
he's got perfect features.
His TV commercials were going on in the 70s, but it's possible I did draw him for something. I think I might have for National Lampoon for something.
Yeah, no,
I forget now. That's nice. That's it. He looks like. It looks like Tom Carvel. There's somebody else he looks like.
Yeah, every one of my drawings looks like at least two other people. Yeah. Usually not the person I'm supposed to be drawing. But
it's coming to me, but
yeah,
let me think about that.
There's always somebody else.
Yule Gibbons. Remember that guy? A little bit like that. Maybe a little like.
This was his birthday. It was in July.
Tip O'Neill, if he didn't have the mustache.
Yeah, again, you get the nose. Just everything.
There's a few people. Yeah. Is that Neil Young opposite him?
Oh no, it's a terrible Marty Feldman. Most of my drawings, like I say, are absolutely terrible.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. Nose should be bigger.
Yeah. I tend to be. Well,
you got the eyes. The nose should be bigger.
Yeah. It's actually a question because it came up with Joe Chardello when we did our live show a couple of months ago. Where do you start with a face?
The process is a sketch.
Do you have a regular thing or
a sketch, a loose sketch, just to block it out, and then from there, like a tighter sketch.
But do you start with eyes, nose, or is it just?
Well, yeah, I think I do. Yeah, eyes and nose and mouth, the features in the face, and then somebody asked like, what do you not like drawing the most the other night? And I said, well, I don't like drawing foreheads because they're mostly the same aside from like old people. I like drawing old people because
lines.
Well, the lines in the face, the bags, the creases, the waddle necks, all that stuff. It's like I have a whole list. I think I had 200 reasons why I like drawing old people faces. But I'm getting old now too, so like I'm not.
Your forehead looks okay for now.
I haven't quite crossed that line yet. Where I haven't seen a liver spot yet, but maybe they're coming. My dad didn't have liver spots, so maybe I'll be blessed and I'll avoid them. But old people are just the faces are interesting because you see the history of their lives like etched into their face. Where younger people, but I broke that rule for this book, for this Underground Comics book. Where again they're all drawn at their prime. For the most part, and when they were in their 20s and 30s.
It's like
some of them started when they were teenagers.
You mentioned there's a couple of guys who I'm looking at the dates. I'm like, that guy had to be like 18.
Yeah,
or
Leslie
17
Cabarga. Someone asked at my book launch also, like, who's the youngest person in the book? I said, I think it's Leslie Cabarga, who was born in 1954, which would put him at 68 now. But he was the youngest. And I said, why is Leslie Cabarga in the book? He said he actually drew Underground Comics before he became, he wrote a book about the Fleischer cartoons, and then he became an expert on lettering and fonts. And he's written like dozens of books about those, but he was an underground cartoon, mostly covers.
Yeah. So, given both of our pandemic degrees of isolation, how did the book launch go? How was it being around a whole bunch of people at Society?
It was like interesting because again, like in 2020, it was like the last thing I did was going to do a podcast with Gilbert Gottfried, February 2020. Then the next month, the shit hit the fan and everything was shut down. So aside from my father's memorial last year, this was like the first public. A lot of people were just really happy, like back to normal. Yeah. Although some people still had their masks on, but that's fine. But it was like a return to old times. It was really nice, So, and I did it with Owen Klein, who directed Funny Pages, that great film.
I haven't seen that yet.
Oh, you got to see it. Yeah. In fact, he'd be a great guest.
Yeah. I will hit you up. As I tend to do, I'll hit you up.
His parents were there. You know his parents?
No.
Kevin Kline is his dad, and Phoebe Cates is his mom.
Well,
they were there beaming with pride because we had a great time. He was like, he's 31. He's a kid, but he just like, it gets every reference. He wanted to talk about Georgie Jessel at length, He gets every reference. He asked, all his questions were bright and smart, and he would be a great guest for you, actually. So
hit you up
once again, I'm your producer. I'm suggesting guests.
That's what I'm hoping for. Last question: who are you reading, or what are you reading?
Oh, what am I reading? What do I have? I got to look around. I'm reading a book about the history of the British invasion in the 1960s called Britmania by Mark Voger. It's a beautiful book. It's filled with images. I'm actually reading that right now. Mark wrote this amazing book, Britmania. I recommend that.
And last weird technical question, because again, now I notice these things because I'm actually drawing a bunch. The thick black outline.
Oh, well, that was, again, a decision because I'm drawing cartoonists.
Yeah.
So I thought that just made sense. I'm drawing them realistically, but they are cartoonists, and I still think of myself as a cartoonist. So let me just add that little element, Okay. There's no thick background around the hair, you might notice.
Yeah.
And there's no thick backgrounds going on in the background. It's just around the bodies. And that was just a decision I made, and people have picked up on that too and said, like, I noticed you, I said, yeah, that was done on purpose. And, I don't think I'll do that again, although I am actually adding that to, a few things, like, not as thick though. So I wanted it to be clear. Yeah. There's a thick background here.
True. Like I say, it's a gorgeous, wonderful book. I'm awfully happy you're doing work like this. So, thanks again for coming on, and we'll do it in time for the next pandemic.
Thanks, Gil. It was fun as always.
And that was Drew Friedman. go check out his wonderful new book, Mavericks and Lunatics, Icons of Underground Comics, from Fantagraphics, and check out a lot of Drew's other work, the Old Jewish Comedians collection, Heroes of the Comics. There's so many things. You can find them at Fantagraphics' website. You should also go to drewfriedman.net to find more of Drew's work. It's got his prints as well as his books and some other great stuff that he's done. And that's drewfriedman.net. I'll have a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one. But I really do have to say that the portraits in Mavericks and Lunatics, they're just extraordinary. And the biographical sketches really are a blast to read. And I learned a lot about some unsung heroes and figures in the undergrounds. And I hope my love of Drew's artwork was pretty apparent from our conversation. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there's this guy putting out these really neat conversational podcasts every week with cultural figures like artists, writers, painters like Drew, translators, musicians, etc. And you can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards. I send out a postcard every day to a different person, and it's really been a wonderful project this year. I'm hoping to keep that going next year. You can also do email or DM. You can also leave a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, and, basically, you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And, messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that and get cut off, just call back and leave a second message and, I'll stitch it all together. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting that would be great to share with the listeners, but I would never do that without the speaker's permission first. So let me know. And again, it is Giving Tuesday, so I hope you will make some sort of donation today or on any other day in your life. Make a contribution to people or institutions in need and help us build a better world, okay? Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.